This will come as a shock to some of you, I'm sure, but I'm not offended by profanity. In fact, I'm way more offended by people who make a point of not using profanity than I am by profanity. I don't want to psychoanalyze myself too much. I don't have the credentials, for one, but I think it might be related to something that happened to me when I was in 4th grade. A bunch of us were outside at recess playing on the lower playground. My elementary school was built on a hill, and behind the school there was what was called the upper playground, and then at the bottom of the hill was the lower playground. And that's where the basketball court and the kickball fields were, and only 4th and 5th graders were allowed down there. It was kind of a big deal, okay? Anyway, a bunch of us were down there playing kickball, and there was a disagreement over something, I've forgotten what, and I got into it with this kid named Jeremy, and I shoved Jeremy and cussed at him. I said, "Fuck you," or something. Again, I forget exactly what. At which point, Jeremy, being a rotten little snitch, went and told one of the teachers. So, before recess was over, Mrs. Klein, our 4th grade teacher, sat me and Jeremy down and had a little talk with us about how we can't be out there shoving each other. And I think she said that we would have to stay inside for recess the next day as punishment or something. And then Mrs. Klein turned to me, and she said, "Steve, I'm especially disappointed in you. It's bad enough that you shoved another student, but what do you think your parents would think if they found out that you were cussing?" I don't remember what I said to that, but I'm sure it was appropriately contrite. But in my head, I was thinking, are you fucking kidding me? I shoved another kid. I put my hands on someone else in anger. But that's supposed to be secondary to me telling him, "Fuck you," while I did it? It was at that point I realized 2 things. First, some people are unreasonably offended by profanity. And second, I have very little patience with those people. And that's a very long-winded setup to tell you that when Tilly dropped Star Trek's first on-screen F-bomb in the 5th episode of Star Trek Discovery's first season, it didn't bother me even a little. In fact, as Tilly said when she dropped that F-bomb, and as Lieutenant Stamets agreed a moment later, I thought it was fucking cool. It was also not nearly as unprecedented as the people clutching their pearls over it made it out to be. So let's take a few minutes here and discuss the history of swearing in Star Trek, why it's not a big deal, why sometimes it's good actually, and why people who have a serious problem with it should just grow up and get over it. First, it's true that there isn't much on-screen swearing in the various Star Trek TV series that were produced prior to Star Trek Discovery. The main reason for this is that those shows were originally produced for American broadcast television, which is regulated by the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC has rules prohibiting obscene, indecent, and profane content from being broadcast over public airwaves, particularly during hours of the day when it's more likely children might be watching. So, if you're producing a TV show intended to be broadcast in prime time, you have 3 options when it comes to profanity. You can include it, but censor it somehow, bleep it out, for example. You can replace actual swear words with asinine made-up baby talk, like they did on Firefly, and to a lesser extent, Babylon 5 and the Battlestar Galactica reboot. Or you can just not have your characters swear, which is what the producers of Star Trek did. And of those 3 options, I think the producers of Star Trek chose the best one. Bleeping or other forms of censorship can be effective if used the right way and in the proper context, but they usually read as funny or in a way that emphasizes the artificiality of the show, which might not be the effect you want to create if what you're producing is more or less a straight drama. And swapping out prohibited words for inoffensive invented substitutes, replacing fuck with frack or frag, for example, is silly and juvenile and undercuts the seriousness of any scene where it happens. I think the best way to deal with profanity when under such constraints is to simply leave it out altogether. If you can't do it, don't do it. Now, I don't think Star Trek dialogue would ever have sounded like something out of a Tarantino movie, but it seems obvious to me that if they weren't limited by those FCC regulations, the writers of pre-Discovery Star Trek TV series would have had their characters swearing more often than they did. Milder profanity that is allowed under FCC rules has been a part of Star Trek from the beginning, hell and damn and so forth. In the Star Trek movies, they never dropped an F-bomb, but Dr. McCoy throws around goddamn and son of a bitch with the casual ease of a practiced profaner. There's Data's classic utterance of, "oh shit," as the Enterprise D is about to crash in Star Trek Generations, and a handful of other instances of the classic Trek and TNG characters employing what Spock would call colorful metaphors in their speech. Speaking of which, I think a couple of the gags from Star Trek IV, where the characters appear inexperienced when using profanity and Spock notices that Kirk is swearing more than usual since they arrived in the 20th century, plus the relative lack of profanity in the franchise in general, left some fans with the impression that the characters in Star Trek don't swear by design, that it's a signifier of how highly evolved humanity has become, and that when the writers of newer versions of Star Trek have characters swearing more often, it's a sign that those writers just don't understand what Star Trek is supposed to be. As with most of the rules such fans impose to limit what Star Trek is supposed to be, this depends on a glib, superficial, and extremely selective interpretation of the material. Sure, Star Trek characters in shows and movies produced prior to the creation of Discovery don't swear all that much, and sure, our contemporary use of language being coarser than what Kirk and Spock are used to is the basis for a couple of jokes in one movie, but to conclude on that basis that Star Trek characters don't, can't, or shouldn't swear, you also have to ignore the facts that those characters were prevented from swearing in most cases by factors that existed outside the show, and that we've frequently seen that Star Trek characters do swear within those imposed limitations. I know I've made this point before when discussing the way some fans just reflexively dismiss more recent versions of Star Trek, but often the things those fans are objecting to in the new stuff are things that have been present in previous iterations of the franchise. For example, the fans who howled at how silly the spore drive is, but aren't bothered at all by equally silly and made-up things like warp drive or subspace that are firmly established parts of the fictional world. Star Trek has always relied on goofy, implausible conceits to explain how our heroes are able to travel from strange new world to strange new world so quickly, and likewise, Star Trek characters have always seasoned their speech with whatever profanity the relevant content guidelines allowed. The only reason it took until 2017 for a Star Trek character to drop an F-bomb is that before 2017, Star Trek shows had always been produced for American broadcast TV where F-bombs aren't allowed. And while there have been 13 Star Trek movies produced, and any of them could theoretically have included a fuck in there somewhere, too many fucks, even when used in a non-sexual context, all but guarantee that the film will get an R rating, and R-rated movies that don't feature Deadpool, Jesus getting the shit knocked out of him for 2 hours, or Joaquin Phoenix reminding us of better movies he was in, tend to gross significantly less at the box office than movies with a PG or PG-13, which is why we haven't seen Dr. McCoy absolutely light into Spock like we all know he wants to. Yet. Star Trek Discovery and its sister shows, Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Lower Decks, and the upcoming Star Trek Strange New Worlds are all being produced for the streaming service Paramount Plus, formerly CBS All Access. Since Paramount Plus is a subscription service and not an over-the-air broadcast station or a channel that's part of a basic cable package, it's not subject to the standards imposed by the FCC. Like premium cable channels, such as HBO and Showtime, Paramount Plus is more or less free to determine its own content standards. And evidently, one of those standards is Star Trek characters can say fuck now, which is fine. In fact, I would argue that it's more than fine. It's good. It gives the writers of Star Trek and the actors who perform the dialogue those writers create for them another tool they can use to convey emotion and reveal character. Profanity is just like any other part of speech. Use it too much or in the wrong way, and it becomes a liability rather than an asset. So far, the writers of Star Trek have used their fuck privileges sparingly and to great effect. Every F-bomb in Star Trek to date has been excellent. The first one, the F-bomb Tilly drops in Choose Your Pain, the 5th episode of Discovery's first season, is still the best one. Tilly is working with Stamets and Burnham to find a way to operate the spore drive without harming the giant tardigrade that they've been forcing to serve as a navigator of the mycelial network. When Stamets realizes the answer, injecting DNA from the mycelium into a host other than the tardigrade, Tilly enthuses, "You guys, this is so fucking cool." Embarrassed about having sworn in front of Stamets, her superior officer, Tilly apologizes, but Stamets isn't upset. He softens, smiles at her, and says, "No, Cadet, it is fucking cool." It's a charming, lovely human moment between these characters, and I'm glad that I, not being an uptight prude who swoons when people say naughty words, am able to enjoy it. The next Star Trek F-bomb comes a little over 2 years later in the 2nd episode of Star Trek Picard, Maps and Legends, and it's one that everyone remembers. When Jean-Luc Picard asks Starfleet Commander-in-Chief Admiral Clancy to reinstate his commission and give him a ship, and Clancy, fuming, mutters, "The sheer fucking hubris." This one really got him riled up. Not only was this a Star Trek character saying the F-word, she was saying it to Jean-Luc Picard. At Jean-Luc Picard, in a really aggressive, disrespectful way. She can't talk to him like that. Doesn't she know who he is? But see, that's the point. She actually knows more about who he is than we do at this point in the series. We think of him as Captain Picard, the guy we watched on TV all those years, the guy who saved the galaxy from the Borg. But 20 years have passed since then, and we know very little about what happened in that time. We see the heroic former captain of the Enterprise asking for Starfleet's help on another noble mission, but she sees this presumptuous old troublemaker who has walked into her office expecting Starfleet to sponsor his personal quest. She addresses him disrespectfully because in that moment she doesn't respect him. Her use of fuck underlines that disrespect. It shows us where Picard stands, and lets Picard himself and us in the audience know that he won't necessarily be able to get by on inspirational speeches and heroic gestures this time around. True, Picard does ultimately save the day by making an inspirational speech and performing a heroic gesture, but introducing that uncertainty early on is important for the Picard series, and Clancy's F-bomb helps to do that. It's a load-bearing fuck, and it holds the weight quite well, I think. The next 2 F-bombs aren't so significant. In Star Trek Picard's 4th episode, Absolute Candor, Captain Rios refers to one of the many holograms that operate on his ship, La Sirena, as, quote, "that fucking hospitality hologram." And in the series' 7th episode, Nepenthe, Dr. Girardi, who has been shown a vision of future destruction by Commodore O, suggests that they let the Romulans capture Soji, saying, quote, "somebody else can find that fucking synth." Casual usage. Less important in terms of character or larger story elements than the previous ones, just a little added seasoning to emphasize the annoyance and anxiety felt, respectively, by those characters. Something profanity, properly utilized, is really good for. The last 2 F-bombs in Star Trek, to date, come in the same episode, the 8th show of Star Trek Picard's first season, Broken Pieces. The first one is another one from Admiral Clancy. Such a potty mouth. Starfleet needs fewer evil admirals and more potty-mouth admirals. It's a clever and satisfying callback to her swearing at Picard in the 2nd episode. Clancy tells Picard to shut the fuck up, but this time she's not doing it to dismiss his request, but because his impassioned arguments in favor of Starfleet's intervention in his mission are unnecessary, since she's already decided to intervene. The second, and the most recent on-screen usage of fuck in Star Trek to date, belongs once again to Dr. Girardi, who announces to the crew of La Sirena that she intends to turn herself into the authorities for this murder she did, tells her shipmates that this is the closest she's ever come to feeling part of a crew, and she's sorry she, quote, had to fucking ruin it. As with the F-bombs in Absolute Candor and Nepenthe, Girardi's F-bomb in Broken Pieces is a more casual usage. It helps to put across her emotional state in the scene. She's upset, guilty, regretful. The profanity serves as an intensifier. She didn't just ruin it. She fucking ruined it. Now, does the line need the F-bomb to work? No, the line is clear enough, and Alison Pill, who plays Girardi, is certainly a good enough actor to get the emotion of the moment across without swearing. But is the line better with the F-bomb? I think it is. Profanity, particularly words like fuck, which are generally perceived as hard profanity, doesn't always improve things, but used properly it does. Swear words are regarded as highly informal, as rude, as crass, as offensive by many people. So when a character chooses to express themselves in that way, they're making a choice to disregard a social norm, to break the rules of decorum, to say, I'm so upset or frustrated or angry or whatever that I can't adequately express what I'm feeling within the bounds of politeness. Or alternatively, to say, I don't care about this social norm, or the fact that people who hear me might be offended. That component of profanity, the disregarding of social norms, is why the made-up words that stand in for genuine profanity in shows like Firefly and those others I mentioned don't have the same effect. Regardless of how we feel about them on an individual basis, we as a society have agreed that certain words are impolite, indecent, profane. These are words that we all either use or have heard used in everyday conversation. They're established in our shared lexicon. Because of that, when someone says fuck or goddamn, it means something. Used properly, these words have impact and strength. When someone says frack or goram, it sounds weak and silly and has no impact because we know that people don't actually talk this way, that those words are being used because the real words aren't allowed. For most of its existence, especially on television, Star Trek has been unable to have its characters use more than mild profanity, so they didn't. They didn't replace profanity with toothless baby talk. They just didn't do it. Now that Star Trek characters are allowed to swear, they occasionally do. I support both of those creative choices. However, I do wish that profanity had been allowed in Star Trek before a few years ago. I've enjoyed Discovery, Picard, and Lower Decks, and I'm looking forward to Strange New Worlds and Prodigy. Something tells me there won't be much cussing in that last one, though. But just think of the virtuosic profane tirades we missed out on because the likes of McCoy, Scotty, Riker, Kira, Sisko, B'Elanna, and Trip, to name only a few, weren't allowed to swear. And when I reflect upon the blood-curdling torrents of profanity we were denied from Chief O'Brien, played by world champion F-bomber Colm Meaney, well, the word tragedy just doesn't seem sufficient, does it? So far, profanity has been used effectively in Star Trek. I don't see the problem with it, and neither do most fans, it seems to me. If you're one of the fans who does have a problem with it, because it offends your tender sensibilities, because you think it makes the show inappropriate for children, because you wish everyone talked like goddamn Sunday school teachers, whatever, I suggest you either watch something else. Like I said, the vast majority of Star Trek ever produced is free of hard profanity, and also there's shit besides Star Trek to watch, or, just get the fuck over it. That's it for me, folks. Don't forget you can support this channel by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives or becoming a channel member by clicking the join button. What do you think about swearing in Star Trek? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.